So this presentation is about reusable digital identity across the globe. The purpose of this presentation is just to give an overview of what's happening around the globe, and there is a lot going on at the moment. It's not a complete overview. Not every jurisdiction is covered. Not every digital identity scheme is covered. It's really a point, and if someone is interested, you can certainly talk to people in this conference and talk to me and talk to specific schemes about what they're doing. The scope of this presentation is limited to reusable digital identity schemes. So it's not about identity proofing solutions on their own. It's about the schemes like Bank ID, schemes like Connect ID in Australia, schemes like Yes.com in Germany. This is the scope of the presentation. A little bit about me. I live in Australia. I live in Australia and work for a company called Connect ID, which is a part of a bigger entity called Australian Payments Plus that is building new digital identity network, hence my interest. I'm also doing quite a bit of work in standard space that helps me to get an overview of what's happening around the world. And in general, my background is consumer identity in banking. That's what I normally do. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of research. This is just some of the latest papers that have been published, but there is a lot more there. I will refer to some of that research in my presentation. There are a lot of initiatives happening around the globe. I won't go through the full presentation analyzing each continent, but you can see that there's a lot going on. And there's definitely a lot of demand from reliant parties, from consumers, from governments that drives all this activity. Every jurisdiction is doing something slightly different. It's very difficult to compare them. It's almost like comparing apples and oranges. It's only that we have 50 or 60 or maybe it's very soon 200 different apples and oranges to compare. There are different models that are used. Some of the jurisdictions, they choose government-driven digital identity schemes. Some of them rely on more commercial-driven, and some of them rely on a mix. My personal opinion that the mix has a potential to be the most successful model, which demonstrated in different parts of the world. There's a different level of adoption, which I'll touch on in a second. It's also centralized, and more often now there is a move towards decentralized models, especially with the activities happening in EIDAS that will drive towards the European wallet. That will certainly increase that shift from centralized to decentralized side of things. But a lot of ecosystems will also be mixed, decentralized and centralized together for different types of use cases, different type of interactions. Some jurisdictions adopt open standards, some adopt proprietary standards, and some, or most probably at the moment, to a certain extent, mixed. One of the reasons for that is that digital identity standards, they are also evolving with the demand, with the changes in the regulation, and I'll touch on that in a second. And there are different levels of privacy in different jurisdictions, all the way from none or no privacy regulations to GDPR-style regulations. Different level of adoption. You can have a look at where the sweet spot is at the moment, and a lot of it points to Northern Europe. Some of the slides, this is 2020 slide that I found, but I don't think it significantly has changed. It's another way to look at it, how many transactions you actually do per year, which is actually quite interesting. And you can see that it could be all the way from one transaction a year via a digital identity ecosystem to all the way pretty much using it 3 times a day, like you see in Sweden, Norway, Estonia, and Denmark. Once again, Northern Europe is definitely winning there. One of the advantages that Northern Europe had is probably the timing of I think one of them is the timing of the introduction of the digital identity. It's happened a while ago, and it became embedded in the economy. I believe it's much harder to introduce it right now into a brand new ecosystem. And EIDAS 2 will definitely change it in Europe and across the globe. Hopefully we'll see other countries popping up on a higher end of transaction rate. In Europe, that's more or less the current state. There are some digital identity schemes, and there was a regulation on EIDAS. EIDAS regulation introduced in 2014. It's gone live around 2018, reevaluated in 2020, which kind of pointed to the still a low level of cross-border transactions, which was one of the main purposes, as well as low adoption in general, and a large number of different identification schemes used by European entities. With EIDAS 2, after the review in 2020, EIDAS 2 regulation was introduced, which has the main goal to open up digital identity to up to 80% of European Union population by 2030, I believe. And it does introduce, every jurisdiction has now will be introducing a new digital wallet that will cater for different credentials and will be interoperable with other jurisdictions within the European Union. If you want to know more about your EIDAS 2, I think there is a presentation at 5:25 that Torsten's doing. So he's going a bit deeper into what's happening in Europe. Worthwhile checking it out. They run at the moment, they run in multiple streams. They just designed architecture reference framework, which I'll reference a little bit later. And they're planning to run 3 or 4 large-scale pilots focusing on different use cases. One of them, education, travel, finance, payments, and so on. But check out Torsten's talk. They are quite aggressive in terms of what they're trying to do, and I find it's much easier to explain the benefits of digital identity, even for us talking to reliant parties, when you look at what the process was before digital identity and what the process is after. So the left-hand side here on the screen, you have the process before, which is weeks and quite expensive, hundreds of dollars per transaction, versus it could be done in minutes or hours and relatively cheap. So that's quite aggressive objective that the European Union has, and good luck to them, because it will also impact all of us, which I'll touch on that in a second. So clearly there are benefits for the users. What's happening in Australia? That's kind of close to my heart. That's where we operate. We have multiple identity initiatives at different levels. So there is a federal government that has created the Trusted Digital Identity Framework, which has relatively good adoption for government services, but no adoption in, unfortunately, no adoption in the private sector. State governments, we have 7 states and territories. We have state governments doing their own thing. Some of them not doing anything at all in digital identity, but 2 of the sort of the leading at the moment, New South Wales is piloting verifiable credentials for their digital driver's license and other state-based credentials. And Queensland is going all in on ISO MDL. That's what they're doing. There have been some attempts in the private sector before Connect ID. With Australia Post is a notable one that has attempted, in 2016, has attempted to implement a scheme, which hasn't worked out. Probably, once again, it's all about the timing. Yep. And I know Lyndon is smiling at me because she was part of that project. We believe that Australia is ready now for economy-wide digital identity, and that's what we're building. We definitely see a lot of demand from reliant parties. It also helped us that we had significant breaches in Australia, data breaches in Australia in the last 12 to 18 months, where the conclusion that I take out of them is all your basic identity data is public now. So your documents, your phone number, first name, last name, date of birth, even before you needed social engineering and Facebook to find those things out. Nowadays, it's all public due to certain breaches that we had with telcos as well as medical providers. And these are the breaches that we know about. What else? So we are trying to, Connect ID is trying to build national identity infrastructure, and one of the things that I'm pretty strong on is trying to build it using open standards. Initially, it started as a bank-driven consortium, but now it became more economy-wide. In the US, which is closer to all of you guys here, most of you guys here that are from the US, one of the initiatives that's happening, one of the range of initiatives happening, rolling out digital driver's licenses, where AMBA, TSA, Apple, Google, and the state governments, together with other vendors, working on rolling out digital driver's license and using ISO MDL standard. And TSA is planning to use them in pre-check. I think that's one of the key use cases that everyone is excited about, where TSA will be using it as in TSA pre-check lines, I think they're called. There is another network that is being launched in the United States, ID Partner. So there was an announcement a couple months ago. They're aiming to connect up to 3,000 banks, raise some money in 2021, and I think they're about to launch. I can't see if Elizabeth is in the room, but Elizabeth she's not? Okay. So, but if you want to know more what's happening with ID Partner, what they're aiming to do, when they're watching, please find Elizabeth Garber. She's around. On global initiatives, so I've touched on global overview, then touched on some jurisdictions. Now I'd like to cover some of the global movements that potentially can impact where identity goes. One of them is GAIN, which has sort of been part of from day one. GAIN is an initiative that came out of a white paper that was written in 2021 by, I think, more than 150 authors. It was sort of a collective community effort to try to breach jurisdictional identity silos. Because if you look at that map before, you'll see that all of these identity initiatives, they happen in isolation. They're not connected to each other. Apart from some of the efforts in the European Union, most of them are not connected to each other. So GAIN was an attempt, or is an attempt, to connect the trusted networks for the purpose of the identity exchange. So there were two main work streams in GAIN. One of them was happening in OAX, where OAX working group looked at the policy that is required, or policy changes that are required to support GAIN. And Nick Madashaw is also around somewhere if you want to know more. In OpenID Foundation, what we did is we ran a proof of concept, or multiple proof of concept, where in first instance in 2021, I think we just did a quick connectivity test and data exchange test between different participants from different jurisdictions. Essentially, a Reliant party from Germany could connect to a Reliant party to an IDP in Japan and receive identity data. So that's just the technical side of things. Then we had a look at next level of detail in the standards, what we need to do, and spend probably spend a year, more I'm looking at Mark, on talking about the trust management. So trust management from a technical perspective, not even from a policy perspective, which we'll see it on our X side, but from a technical perspective, how does a system, or AP system from Italy, knows that it can trust IDP from Japan? So we looked at different options, available standards, because one of the things we try to do, we try to not to reinvent standards, not to create new standards. And we settled on OpenID Federation, OpenID kind of federation specification to implement that. And in the last 3-4 months, we've attempted to test it, or successfully tested it. where we had 3 federations. One, yes.com in Germany, digital identity network with credit unions and banks in Germany. Italian Federation had 2 different networks. They have 2 different networks, but they had one network they set up for the purpose of the test. And Authlit from Japan set up a federation where they had their own IDP, and they also hosted KDDI Reliant Party. It was considered to be successful. Now we're thinking in terms of what's happening next. The simple demonstration that we had, I think at IW workshop, was probably, it's like a 30-second demonstration, but it really demonstrates the value of this network. It's a lot of it is travel related. When you arrive, let's say when I arrived in the US, and if there was a requirement for me to provision a SIM and identity proof myself for provisioning a SIM card or eSIM, then it's a perfect use case for it. And we had a demonstration where KDDI did exactly that. So they created a QR code. Imagine you walk out in the airport, see the telco advertising, snap the QR code, log in with your Australian bank, for example, and provision a SIM. So your identity has been proved, the service has completed. That's what we did, and KDDI did an awesome job to creating a quick demo that demonstrates it perfectly. If you want to know more about GAIN, I think, first of all, there will be another version of the paper, because a lot of things have changed since 2021. So Elizabeth is leading collection of all the information, all the changes that have happened, and the paper will be updated. But you can speak to Elizabeth, Torsten, Mark, or myself if you want to know more, especially. Yep.
We are actually looking for organizations that wish to participate in the next phase of the talk, which is doing trust for verifiable credentials implementation.
That's right. So one of the activities that we took on, because we started off more with federation-style interfaces, but now we're plugging in verifiable credentials as well and trying to look at it at the framework level. And yes, the POC will be expanded. So any interested parties, to contact us or have a look at OpenID Foundation website. There is a working group page which tells you who to contact if you want to join. You want to join? Awesome. Sorry?
Is there a deadline for joining the POC?
Is there a what?
A deadline.
A deadline? No. Join the working group, have a look around, see what's happening, and then make your decision. You don't need to pay anything. It's a community effort. Won't talk probably too much more about GAIN, but we can talk more, and Mark is next to you, can explain everything that you need to do. It's just one of the initiatives that I wanted to highlight that potentially impacts what's happening globally. Another one is Open Wallet Foundation. So Open Wallet Foundation has been formed probably about 6 months ago now as a part of the Linux Foundation, and it aims to create a digital wallet engine that allows anyone to build a wallet. So it's quite a significant initiative, and there is a certain, and I'll touch on it in a second, there's a certain shift towards the wallet-based interactions. And I think Open Wallet Foundation definitely has enough interest at the moment. You can see how many different significant parties trying to join it at the moment, and they're trying to set up, and there will be significant donations from different parties to kickstart Open Wallet Foundation. 5 minutes warning. Thank you. I should go. These are some of the parties that you can recognize logos. The focus is not just identity for Open Wallet Foundation. The focus is much broader. Could be any type of access cards. Mobile driver's licenses. So that will still, well, I mentioned what's happening in the US. It is a global initiative, and it will definitely continue. The rollout in different countries will continue to happen. That standard seems to be settling relatively well as they develop other types of interactions. They started with offline, now they're going towards online interactions. MOSIP is another interesting initiative that I think Ramesh, I don't know if he's here, he's definitely at the conference. I can speak to Ramesh from MOSIP a lot more, but they build in open source, free to use software for digital identity schemes, focusing on the developing world. They're trying to their focus is slightly different. Developing world is focusing on slightly different concerns. A lot of it is access to services, and inclusion. Western will have slightly different concerns to address, but that's definitely an initiative to watch. Other observations, we know it will continue to grow. EIDAS, why I said EIDAS will be important for all of us, it actually is starting to drive the standards development and has a sort of feedback. The architecture reference framework, which was slide on the right, tells you this is what they're planning to build right now as it stands right now, but actually pushes a lot more pressure on the standard bodies to complete some of those open standards to be able to support. Like SGJOT is a relatively new standard, but it's already an architecture reference framework ready to be implemented. OWF potentially might or should support the wallet development or reference wallet development for EIDAS 2, and so on and so on. Trust management, once again, it becomes a hot topic, not just for GAIN, but also EIDAS and a few other ecosystems looking at the same problem. So it's quite a hot topic. What else? There is also convergence in the standards that you can notice in the last year. So we used to have 3 different separate streams of OpenID world, SSI world, and then MDL world. There are a lot more initiatives right now that use all of those, or blend all of those, which is quite important because now we actually get the practical outcomes, practical results. I think I mentioned that. A lot more about choice of provider. Mentioned trust management, and I think what I'll finish on is I think there is a lot more pressure right now to develop all these digital identity schemes to open standards, and that's probably one of the most important things that will allow us to be interoperable. We're not in silos anymore. We'll have to interoperate. That's it. Thank you. Any questions? I don't know how much time we have. Maybe 2 minutes. If any questions, I'm happy to answer. 3, 2, 1.
I just wonder
Yeah.
your comment on that one framework, whatever, that's focused on the third world, or
Yep.
whatever we call it.
Mostly.
Why would it be different? I mean, identities are the same, yeah? So, I mean, why would we protect people differently in different parts of the world?
It's not the technology that is necessarily different, but the focus is different. And the focus, I had a very interesting conversation with Gail. I don't know if Gail is here. Gail from OpenID Foundation. She just came back from Africa, and MOSIP has a large presence in Asia and Africa. I guess part of it is the way those initiatives are funded. Focus is more on inclusion than anything else. Underlying standards might be the same, but it's probably around delivery. Like they can't sign up for a big vendor and pay $100 million. So Australian government spend probably $1 billion right now on digital identity and haven't achieved anything. The developing nations don't have that amount of money. That's why open source becomes even more important. I think similar things happening in Brazil with some of the simple identity systems. They rely much more on open source than the Western banks do, for example. Just referencing open banking. But if you want to speak to Ramesh and Gail, if you want to find out more, because people are starting to talk about South and North in digital identity.
I guess the key thing will be that they still remain interoperable.
Yes. Long term, we should be interoperable, yes. And that's why we're all here. Thank you.
You mentioned trust management is hot right now.
Yep.
Any further comments on that, where you're seeing activity?
So GAIN is one which I've sort of been part of, and that's probably the most that I know more about. EIDAS has the same problem. So they will have different jurisdictions producing wallets, and entities will need to understand how do I trust, I have a connection right now from a system. How do I know it comes from a trusted source? How do I know it comes from a vetted jurisdiction? And the same thing on the reliant party side. So it will be, it's definitely an unsolved problem right now in the architecture reference framework. United Nations Development Fund is also looking at trust management from their perspective. They started off with the COVID credentials being shared across the world. Now they're looking a bit broader in the health sector. And I think Lucy as well here that does the work for UNDP. They're doing the same type of work. They're trying to do the same exploration, but the problem is the same. How do I trust another system that's trying to connect to me? How do I know they vetted and can still talk to us? Any large federation, like an Access Federation that you guys run in, will have the same problem. In a small ecosystem, if you're just a solution and you just hub and spoke, you can easily manage it. But in a distributed global system, because different entities even regulated by different jurisdictions. And there is no way for Australian Reliant party to understand that the yes.com entity there is the one that can be trusted, because we don't know anything about that market. So I think I'm over time.